It was supposed to be just another day in a quiet suburban neighborhood, but things quickly took a dramatic turn. A homeless U.S. veteran, down on his luck but still holding on to his pride, sat quietly on a park bench, minding his own business. That's when she showed up. A woman, later known as Karen by witnesses, stormed over, her voice sharp and judgmental. She accused the man of loitering and causing trouble, her words dripping with disdain. But it didn't stop there. Karen pulled out her phone and called the cops, claiming the veteran was a threat. The man didn't argue. He simply sat there, his weathered face showing more exhaustion than anger. He faced worse, after all. As the minutes passed, bystanders began to gather, whispering among themselves. Some recorded the scene, unsure of what might happen next. When the police arrived, the tension reached its peak. Everyone expected the officers to side with Karen, as her loud accusations filled the air. But what happened next left everyone stunned. The officers didn't react the way Karen had hoped, and the situation took a surprising, heartwarming turn that no one saw coming. Stay tuned to find out how a moment of prejudice turned into an unforgettable lesson on compassion, justice, and humanity. This is a story you won't want to miss. The police car rolled to a stop, its flashing lights drawing even more attention. Two officers stepped out, their faces calm but serious. Karen wasted no time marching over to them, pointing furiously at the man on the bench. Her voice carried across the park as she described him as dangerous and out of place, insisting something needed to be done. The veteran, sitting quietly with his old, weathered backpack at his feet, didn't move. His hands rested in his lap, and his gaze stayed fixed on the ground. Anyone watching could see the years of hardship etched into his face. He didn't look dangerous. He looked tired. A few people in the growing crowd murmured in disagreement with Karen's accusations. Some whispered about how she was overreacting, while others tried to get a better look at the man she was so adamant about removing. One bystander, a young woman with a baby stroller, muttered, "He's not bothering anyone." As Karen continued her rant, one of the officers approached the veteran. The man finally looked up, his deep, tired eyes meeting the officer's. "Sir, is everything okay?" The officer asked gently. The veteran nodded slowly, his voice quiet but steady. "I'm just resting here. I'm not causing any trouble." Meanwhile, the other officer tried to calm Karen down, but her voice only grew louder. She demanded action, saying, "People like him don't belong here." The tension was thick in the air, and all eyes were on the officers. What would they do next? The answer was far from what anyone expected, and it would soon leave the entire crowd in shock. The veteran's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Karen's escalating fury. Her words became sharper, her accusations more exaggerated. "He's probably dangerous. You don't know what people like him are capable of," she snapped, her voice loud enough to draw more attention. The officers exchanged a look, their expressions unreadable. One of the officers turned back to the veteran. "Do you have any identification with you, sir?" he asked, his tone still calm. The man hesitated for a moment, then slowly reached into his pocket. He pulled out a worn military ID card, the edges frayed, the photo faded. The officer took it, examining it carefully before glancing back at the man. "You served?" the officer asked, his tone softening. The veteran gave a small nod. "Yes, sir. Army. 8 years." His voice was steady but carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. The officer paused, as if letting the words sink in. Meanwhile, Karen, now pacing, was still ranting. "Why are we even wasting time on this? He's clearly lying to get sympathy. I've seen his type before." Her words caused a ripple of unease among the bystanders. some of whom began to step closer, their phones still recording. But then something unexpected happened. A man from the crowd stepped forward. "That's enough," he said firmly, addressing Karen. "You don't know his story. You don't know anything about him." His voice was steady but filled with quiet anger. Karen shot him a glare, but the crowd murmured in agreement. The officer holding the veteran's ID walked back to his partner, speaking in hushed tones. Whatever they discussed, it wasn't clear, but their body language shifted. Something was happening, and it wasn't what Karen expected. The tension in the park was electric. Karen crossed her arms, tapping her foot impatiently, her frustration growing as the officers remained calm. "Are you going to do something or not?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "This man is a problem, and you're just standing around." The veteran shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing, his hands clasped tightly together. He seemed to shrink under the weight of the stairs, but there was a quiet resilience in his posture, as if he'd weathered storms far worse than this. The officers, still speaking quietly, suddenly straightened up. The one holding the ID handed it back to the veteran, his voice steady but firm. "Sir, thank you for your service," he said, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "You're not in any trouble. Please let us know if you need anything." The words hit the crowd like a ripple. People began murmuring, some nodding in approval, while others looked at Karen, waiting for her reaction. She was visibly stunned, her mouth opening and closing, as if searching for something to say. "What do you mean he's not in trouble?" "He's loitering. He's dirty asterisk." "This isn't fair," she sputtered, her voice cracking with anger. Before the officers could respond, another voice from the crowd cut through the tension. It was the same man who had stood up earlier. "You're the one causing trouble, not him," he said firmly, stepping closer. "This man served our country. What have you done but yell at people?" Karen glared at him, but now the crowd was shifting. The murmurs grew louder, voices of support for the veteran overpowering Karen's protests. The officers exchanged another glance, their expressions calm but purposeful. Whatever was about to happen next, it would change everything. Just as the crowd seemed to rally behind the veteran, Karen raised her voice again, desperation creeping in. "You're all being fooled," she yelled. "How do you know he's really a veteran? That ID could be fake. People like him know how to scam the system." Her words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory, and for a moment, a few people glanced at each other uncertainly. The officers didn't flinch. One of them turned to the veteran. "Sir, can you tell us your name and where you served?" he asked, his voice calm but deliberate. The veteran sat up a little straighter, his voice steady but with a trace of weariness. "Daniel Hart. I served in Afghanistan, 3rd Infantry Division. I was honorably discharged 10 years ago." The officer nodded, then spoke into his radio. Karen smirked, clearly thinking she'd won, but the crowd was silent, waiting. A few tense minutes passed as the officer quietly confirmed the information. Then he nodded and turned back to Daniel, his face softening. "Everything checks out, Mr. Hart. You're exactly who you say you are." Karen's face twisted in disbelief. "That doesn't prove anything. He's still causing problems just by being here." She snapped, but her voice wavered now, less certain. Before anyone could respond, a soft voice from the crowd spoke up. "Daniel." A woman stepped forward, her hands trembling. She was older, her eyes wide as they locked on the veteran. "It's you, isn't it?" she whispered. Daniel's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, his voice barely audible. The crowd gasped as the woman stepped closer, tears streaming down her face. The tension shifted again, and suddenly the story took a direction no one could have predicted. The park fell completely silent as the older woman, Mrs. Callahan, approached Daniel. Her voice quivered with emotion as she spoke. "I thought I'd never see you again," she said, her tears flowing freely. Daniel stood slowly, his eyes wide with recognition. "You're from the shelter," he said, his voice heavy with surprise. Mrs. Callahan nodded. "You stayed with us years ago when you first came home. My late husband used to talk about you all the time. He said you had the kindest heart, even when you were struggling to find your way." The crowd, now captivated, watched as Karen stood frozen, her expression a mix of confusion and irritation. The officers remained quiet, giving the moment space to unfold. Karen finally found her voice. "So what? That doesn't change anything. He still doesn't belong here," she snapped, but her words now felt hollow, drowned out by the emotions swirling in the air. Mrs. Callahan turned to her sharply. "How dare you?" she said, her voice trembling with both sadness and anger. "This man has given more to this country than most of us could ever imagine. He belongs wherever he chooses to be." Her words struck a chord with the crowd, who began to murmur in agreement. Then came the twist no one saw coming. One of the bystanders, who had been recording everything, stepped forward. "You're on camera," he said to Karen, his voice calm but firm. "This entire thing has been live-streamed. Thousands of people are watching, and they're not on your side." Karen's face turned pale as she realized the weight of the situation. The officers, seeing her stunned silence, politely asked her to leave the park. She reluctantly stormed off, her protest drowned out by the quiet applause of the crowd. As the tension lifted, Mrs. Callahan turned back to Daniel. "You don't have to be alone anymore," she said softly. "Come back to the shelter. Let us help." Daniel's eyes filled with gratitude as he nodded. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving behind a sense of justice and a renewed faith in humanity. As the crowd began to disperse, the energy in the park shifted. What had started as a scene of tension and hostility transformed into something deeply human, an act of connection, compassion, and understanding. Daniel stood quietly for a moment, his weathered face softening as Mrs. Callahan placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Let's get you somewhere warm," she said kindly, her voice filled with care. Daniel nodded, his gratitude visible in his eyes. One of the officers stepped forward and handed him a card. "If you ever need assistance, don't hesitate to call," he said, his tone genuine. "And thank you for your service, Mr. Hart." Daniel accepted the card with a quiet thank you, his voice heavy with emotion. As Mrs. Callahan began to lead him away, a few of the bystanders approached, offering small words of encouragement and even a few handshakes. The young woman with the stroller smiled warmly. "You deserve better," she said softly before walking away. Karen, meanwhile, was long gone, her dramatic exit overshadowed by the quiet triumph of kindness and truth. The video of the encounter spread quickly, sparking conversations about prejudice, compassion, and the struggles many veterans face after serving their country. That night, Daniel found himself back at the shelter he hadn't seen in years, surrounded by familiar faces and the promise of a fresh start. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not as a problem, but as a person with a story worth hearing. Sometimes it takes just one moment to remind us all of the power of understanding and the importance of standing up for what's right. And in this small park, on an otherwise ordinary day, humanity shined through.